Hunter Maats, it's a pleasure to talk to you. I've been listening to your podcast, Mixed Mental Arts, and finding a lot of goodness and joy from listening to that. Hearing you on other podcasts as well, right? Several years back, you wrote a book called The Straight A Conspiracy, and at that time, I think you made the podcast tour, right? You were on all kinds of different shows and stuff. Could you just tell the people listening here, tell me who you are?
Well, I'm a guy who grew up all over the world. And part of the experience of growing up all over the world was that, I was constantly moving between all these different cultures. And, and in the normal course of things, you would grow up in a small town. You'd be surrounded by people who thought like you. You would figure out what the rules of the game are, and then you would play by the rules of that game. For me, the rules kept changing. So I was very confused, didn't really know how the world worked, and sort of picked up at a very early age that, if you wanted some certainty, if you wanted some things you could bet on and trust in, that the place to go was science. And so that was the real emotional appeal of science for me. And then I ended up, I was like, man, I need to get to wherever science is best. And so for me, that was Harvard. And so worked very hard to get in there, got in there, spent a year doing research at Cold Spring Harbor, which is a biochemistry lab that was headed up by my personal hero, Jim Watson of Watson and Crick. Got to spend a year living in Jim's basement. Yep, big deal. And, there's an old saying that you should never meet your heroes. And it is 100% true. And it's because, it's much like being in awe of your own dad, right? Like you just have this mythic idea of him that bears no correlation to reality and is a totally unrealistic expectation for any human being. So as a kid, I had this mythic idea of Jim Watson, who would be, a man who could literally hold lightning in his hands. And it turned out that wasn't true. And Jim was very much mortal in flesh and blood like the rest of us. But that was nonetheless a very difficult emotional experience. I went to college. I majored in biochemistry because I really had no other idea what else to do. And then, finished college, was clear that I didn't want to go into the lab because I found it to be a miserable place. And I was disappointed by, I thought that science was about sort of really, everybody sort of relentlessly focused on trying to solve the world's problems. And that wasn't what I found at the lab. I found a lot of petty infighting and small-minded politics. And
humans, right? Go figure.
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. And especially, anytime there's a lot of money, a lot of prestige, all that stuff on the line, people get more focused on divvying up the spoils than on making sure that they're, that we're actually solving problems. So that was that. But, I moved out here. I had to LA, had to pay my bills. So I started tutoring. And one of the first things that I read out here was Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, one of the all-time great books. Frankl, was a psychologist. He lived through the Holocaust, and, he basically looking around at the Holocaust at who lived and who died. It was the people who had some kind of purpose. Because if you had some sort of purpose, that shaped your daily choices. You made an effort to, take care of yourself, to eat well, to form relationships, to, do the sort of things necessary to keep you alive in those tough circumstances. And what I took away from that was that even though, Harvard had turned out to be something other than what I thought it would be, and science had turned out to be something other than what I thought it would be, that the very act of having a goal that was big and challenging had served to organize my life. So I was like, I have to pay my bills tutoring. Why not pick a big goal that fits my day job? And so I made a decision in 2005 that I was going to do whatever it takes to fix education. And that has organized my life for the last 12 years. And it's been fantastic.
Cool.
And so part of that was that, what I actually had in front of me were these teenagers, right? And these kids that I was tutoring. And it was actually an ideal group of kids to be working with because they were rich and they had every resource imaginable. And still, they weren't doing well in school. And so usually in America, you hear this narrative that it's about resources, like we need to get kids iPads, we need to spend more money. And the point is these were kids who had literally every resource you could imagine, and yet they still weren't doing well. And so then, along with my co-founder, Katie O'Brien, who I ended up co-writing The Straight A Conspiracy with, we had to be like, well, what's the issue here? If it's not resources, then what is it? And we came to realize that it really came down to resourcefulness. Were you able to take the resources that you had available and piece them together in a way that allows you to actually solve problems? And if anybody has any doubt, because obviously as soon as you start talking about these things, what ends up happening is people start getting nervous because they're like, well, who is this guy? Is this some sort of libertarian thing? Does he want to defund schools or, vouchers or whatever? But here's a story that Katie and I found really powerful that I think really tells you a lot about humans. So there's this kid in Malawi named William Kamkwamba. And he wrote a book called The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind. And shortly, Malawi, has 2% of people have electricity. It all basically comes from this one hydroelectric dam. And then because of agricultural problems, there's runoff and the dam silts up. And so periodically the dam breaks down. So electricity is this very scarce commodity. And Kamkwamba grew up in a fairly rural part of Malawi. His family were farmers and there was a famine. So suddenly his family couldn't afford the few $100s a year it took to send him to school. So William really wants an education. So he finds one of his friends who's still going to the school and starts just copying all of his notes, all of his homework, anything he can do to try and keep up with the material in the hopes that next year, if there's a better harvest, he can go back to school. But this becomes really onerous, right? Like it's the kid comes home from school, he's having to copy the notes late at night, get it to his friend. It's not working. So instead, what he decides to do is he says, I'm just going to walk a couple of miles. There's a library that's paid for by the Americans, and I'm just going to read whatever I can to improve my mind with the hopes that one day it will pay off and sort of prepare me for school. And while he's there, he finds...
Right out of Good Will Hunting, right?
Right out of Good Will Hunting. And while he's there, he finds this book on electricity generation. And he's amazed because in this book, there's a picture, and it's a picture of an electricity generating wind turbine. And he's like, wait a minute, Malawi has no electricity, but we have lots of wind. There's so much wind. Why couldn't I turn that wind into electricity? And so he goes to the local junkyard, and he finds all this scrap, and he takes old bits of, plastic buckets and makes them into blades for the thing. The kid is so poor he can't afford a flathead screwdriver. So he takes a bicycle spoke, heats it up, flattens it out, and makes it into a screwdriver. And he actually builds this electricity generating wind turbine. And then because, electricity is so scarce and so rare, but, like many places in the developing world, they all have cell phones. And, people will charge to allow people to charge their cell phones. And Kamkwamba starts selling his electricity to the people of the village to come charge their cell phones for cheaper. And so news spreads of this. A bunch of expats come out and come to see this windmill. And then they're like, holy shit, this is amazing. And they fly Kamkwamba up to Kenya, and he goes and gives a talk at TEDx Kilimanjaro. The world sees this, they react, They think it's amazing. Money is brought together. They pay for him to go to the Nelson Mandela School for Leadership in South Africa, and he ultimately ends up going to Dartmouth. So the point is that, whatever resources an American has, no one in America, is poorer than William Kamkwamba, right? We're not living through a famine. We're not having to go through these sorts of things. So we have the resources, but this gets the key problem and sort of feature of the human mind, which is that thinking and feeling are always linked. And so our feelings shape our reality. And so a good example of this, I see from behind you that I'm guessing, I can't see that your head, and I'm guessing your wife's head. Um, but I'm guessing
Right.
that's you. And, so, are you married?
I am married, a family man, 3 kids, 2 girls,
Yeah.
1 boy. Yep.
Very nice. And do you and your wife ever have different feelings about each other, or is it always just straight love all the time?
Oh my gosh, it's been to the depths of the valley, right? I mean, it's
Yeah.
yeah. There's a lot of up and down, and yeah. I mean, I don't think I'm really at liberty to say a lot about her and what she's experienced, but she's had some pretty significant difficulties, and a lot of them have root in our relationship. So yeah, I think you observe correctly that there are
Yeah.
certainly ups and downs.
And that's the nature of any human relationship. It doesn't matter what it is, whether it's romantic or not. But the point is that when you're in love with someone, right, they seem perfect. They can do no wrong. There are no faults, right? And that's sort of that's how you get into a relationship. And then you get into a relationship and suddenly you start having fights. And suddenly now the emotion has changed. And so now all you can see are their faults. You're just like, man, this thing and that thing you do with the toilet seat and that thing you do with this. And, it all drives me nuts. So suddenly you're seeing totally different things. And what happens is that, over the course of the relationship, you alternate between these different perspectives and you come to round out the view of the person and start to develop a more and more realistic view of the person because you've seen all these different sides of them. But it's the same
Like Jim
thing.
Watson, right?
Like Jim Watson. And, it's the same thing. Like I was in love with Jim Watson. I had this perfect image of Jim. And then, suddenly I met him and I saw only his faults. And then, yeah, over time, my relationship with Jim, I mean, that's a perfect analogy, has come to become much more rounded and balanced. And I have come to realize that Jim is a man. It's very much, I mean, Jim, we only spent a very little amount of time together, but yeah, I mean, he played a huge, huge role in my psyche. He's like a father figure to me. So there, that is the experience of being human. And, part of that is that, you can be sitting surrounded by resources and feel like you don't have what it takes to succeed. And so our students would say these things like, oh, I didn't get the math gene. I don't have, a natural ear for languages. They felt that they were missing something, right, genetically that was required to succeed in school, right? And that reality felt true to them, right? Just as all emotional realities feel true. But in practice, William Kamkwamba, who, objectively speaking, had far fewer resources, sits around and is like, man, I got so many opportunities. This is amazing. Look at all this stuff. There's all this trash that I could turn into treasure. And so ultimately, although, the straight A conspiracy is really, sort of began from, what students have been taught to believe about their brains, it's ultimately teaching them about how to use your brain. Right? So the human brain is this incredibly powerful tool, but, we never get taught how to use it. I mean, the analogy that Katie O'Brien, my co-author, always uses is, it's like taking a teenager and not even giving them the most basic driver's ed. You're just like, yeah, here's the car, go on the freeway, you'll figure it out. And so, we were never taught as kids how to use our brains. And so some of us sort of figured out a few things. We might have figured out the brake and the accelerator, but we never really learned how to use this. And so, our job was we went around and, we went through all the science, we pulled it together, and then we had to package it in a form that kids could actually hear because, I mean, that's the point. You have young kids, right? Your young kids are not going to go off and read, a whole bunch of scientific papers. Like, that's a ridiculous idea, right? You have to tell it in a way that they can hear it.
Yeah.
So yeah,
I think
that's
the
my
book
deal.
was cool because it was. I mean, it was both that, right? It's kind of a how-to manual for kids and something that can appeal to kids. But it was also, I mean, as I was reading it, I was enthralled, and less to the how-to manual stuff, although that was pretty cool and insightful and everything. But some of the kind of the cognitive science about it and thinking about how the brain works and the Carol Dweckiness of it. You are not, you are not your destiny, right? That you can write your own script and you can become the person that you want to be, and who you are is not set in stone. You have abilities that you can grow and you can become whatever you want to be, right? Which is what we kind of lip service tell our kids when they're young, but we don't demonstrate that in our actions, right? I think that so many of us, and myself included, right? We wind up in, doing the 8 to 5, drive back and forth to an office thing and kind of leave our dreams behind. And we might tell our kids about, oh, I had this dream, and we demonstrate to them that this thing that I wanted to be, well, it was out of my reach, right? And so I think the message comes in loud and clear. Actions speak louder than words, and that's what kids see.
Yeah, absolutely. And kids are smart. I mean, they're reading the lie of the land, and, they're very socially intelligent, and they're able to spot you're saying this thing, but you're doing this completely different thing. So, that's why, I mean, ultimately a large part of it is just being transparent with them. And, I mean, part of it may be saying like, yeah, I did have a dream, and now I'm stuck working this 8 to 5, and you don't want to be doing that. And here's why. And, let's figure out a better way for you to get out of this. And by the way, as we help you figure out a way to get out of it, I may also figure out a way to get out of it. Or I may find a way to make it more enjoyable or more satisfying or whatever. Because realistically, I mean, and this is sort of how we then evolved into mixed mental arts. We kept on getting people saying, you should write a book for adults. You should write a book for adults. We all need this. We all need this. And what we came to realize is that, yes, we do all need this. And we all need this for one very specific and particular reason. And that's what we call the jobocalypse. So there's all this, AI, automation, software coming along that are going to be destroying routine work. And that's already been happening for a long time. And it's only going to ramp up and become more intense. And the problem is that the industrial age model of education taught people to be passive and to wait for things to show up, right? So you're just sort of handed assignments. You do your assignment. Once the assignment is done, you're free, right? And that was the old model. And the problem is that nowadays, that attitude of like, I hope a job shows up. Where will the job come from? Will a president just give me a job? Where did the jobs go? Oh, they went to China. Now we're going to bring them back. And these are, nice stories, but the reality is no, the jobs have been disappeared by automation. And so now what you have to do is you have to be much more proactive. You have to be in charge of your learning. You have to always be learning. You have to be seeking out new opportunities. And so what we realized is that, people always focus on, sometimes if you hang out in ed circles, you'll hear this idea of like, we need to retool the educational system for the 21st century. But in practice, it's a much larger problem than that, because for those of us who needed that 21st century education 20, 30, 40 years ago and are still now in the workplace, well, we need to be reskilled and retrained in order to be able to cope with this transition too. And so that's a large part of what mixed mental arts ended up becoming, was basically, how do we as a community figure out ways for all of us to have the benefits of technology and to have a better way forward and be able to thrive and survive in this new environment.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think there's a lot of cool things that you went into there, and mixed mental arts, right? I'm going to want you to define that term. But before getting into that, I wanted to share that, my experience wasn't all that different than yours. I went to college, I got a physics degree, and I kind of along the way was doing some tutoring for freshman and sophomore physics classes, and decided that, hey, this education thing is a lot more interesting than working at the energy lab or something along those lines, and kind of was going down the path of, hey, I want to become an educator, and and was interested in that. And tutoring didn't really last as a job beyond the time I was in school, but it was a thing that really was interesting to me. And I think education is of course foundational and something that I really put value on. At the same time, the things that you say about schooling, right? That it's turning out obedient drones who take tasks and do those things and are essentially, in a lot of ways the same as some of the robots that they're being replaced with, is, it's true. And it's, so education is an evolving thing, right? The Mark Twain quote of never let schooling get in the way of your education or something along those lines, right? It's, appealing to me. So, and I wound up, eventually I wound up writing software as my job, and kind of forgot about that I really wanted to be an educator and some of these things. And over time, I finally decided that doing a podcast talking to software developers was a really interesting thing, and has kind of rekindled this, wanting to put information out in the world. And technology, of course, has enabled that, right? Being able to download audio makes these kinds of things where we can have conversations and try to help each other learn. It enables it and makes it really something worthwhile, something that kind of rekindles some of those dreams and kind of makes me remember that, hey, I can have a growth mindset, right? Even at 41 years old, so much so with my kids, right? And that's kind of the same thing that you're talking about with having resources available, easily accessible, and not feeling that we have the ability to access them because of some deficiency. And it's a really nasty story that we tell ourselves. So I guess,
and it's not a story that, I think that's the key thing to know, as well as where that story came from, and that story came from the eugenics movement. And, it was a story that was so Darwin writes his Origin of Species, and then Darwin has this cousin, Francis Galton. And Francis Galton, an English aristocrat, hears these ideas of, heredity and all of that sort of stuff. And he says, aha, this confirms what I always knew, which is that some people are just naturally better than others. How does an English aristocrat come to this conclusion? I mean, what a fucking, leap, right? Like, clearly he had to do a lot of thinking to come up with that. So Galton writes this book, Hereditary Genius. And that is basically the seed from which this idea metastasizes into the eugenics movement. It ultimately leads to the hijacking of the IQ test. Originally, the IQ test was intended as a measure of where people are, not what they could ultimately become, right? So it was designed like, we're going to measure where are you right now, and then we're going to come in and we're going to mentor you and help you grow past that. And IQ can and has grown a lot, right, over the last, the course of human history, right? So if you took somebody from the 1850s and you gave them an IQ test today, they would score 70. Right. So an average person from the 1850s in America would be regarded as borderline mentally retarded by modern standards. And that's because we live in a much more rich and stimulating environment. And so we're challenged just by being in the 21st century. And the analogy that I always use for this is, imagine if any of us were born in the 24th century, right? Like Star Trek, right? We'd be way smarter than we are. And why? Because we would have access
for some definitions of smart, I guess.
Well, but I think also in practice, you think about, like, if you're exposed to all sorts of alien species, right? How much harder do you have to think about things like culture? Do you have to think about, like, how you interact with people, what codes of behavior and conduct are? So you're being challenged at levels, right, emotionally, that you're not being challenged now. And in practice, the same thing is really, that's part of what the internet is doing to us, is that, in the 1950s, you grew up in your small village, wherever it was in the world, whether it was in Ohio or Cambodia, and you had very little exposure to other cultures. Now, because of globalization and travel and the internet and all of that, you're having to make sense of so many different cultures, so many different humans who think so many different ways. And so you're forced to develop more astuteness about all of this. And that was, my experience as a child, and that is now the world's experience. You're all living through my childhood. Welcome to it. 2017. That's what my childhood was like. I just had it in 1987. So, the point is that we are forced by our environment to become smarter, and that's why people become smarter over time. What happened was this guy, Lewis Terman, perverted the IQ test. And, ironically, Lewis Terman was at Stanford, which is where Carol Dweck is. And Carol Dweck describes her life's work as undoing the damage caused by Lewis Terman. So this was a nasty myth that was created nearly 150 years ago that has spread like a pernicious cancer throughout our society.
So I've heard it said that that IQ, and I assume that it's true that IQ correlates pretty strongly with success in life and some of these kinds of things. I suspect that it's not necessarily a genetic kind of a thing, but what we were talking about there, right, with that message of eugenics and the kind of the fixed mindset that you are kind of what you are born to be. Does that explain that away, or is there maybe something more to it?
Well, you're going to hear, and I mean, this is part of also why we're doing mixed mental arts, right? Like you can wander into different parts of the IQ research. And if you were to look at those little pieces, you would come away with totally different conclusions. It's very much, there's the story that we use on mixed mental arts of the blind man and the elephant. Six blind men come along and they decide to figure out what this thing is, right? And they don't know that it's an elephant. And the first one walks up to the tail and feels the end of it and feels the hairs and thinks it's a rope. And then the second one, walks the trunk and feels it wriggling in his hand and thinks it's a snake, and on and on and on. One decides the side is a wall, another decides the leg is the column, another decides the tusk is a spear. And then they all proceed to arguing that the other ones are idiots. Because clearly it is whatever they think it is. And this is a really good metaphor. It was originally a metaphor for religion. It's actually an amazing metaphor for academia. There is a thing called the elephant, right? There is a reality of how human intelligence works. But in practice, it's all descended into these sectarian differences of territoriality, where there's not a lot of mutual respect between different disciplines, and there isn't trying to figure out how all of these pieces fit together. So if you want, we can sort of look at a few of those pieces, and then you can start to see what picture of something that is elephant adjacent might emerge.
There's a little bit of a danger of just going on a tangent and completely forgetting that. But I think that's really, it's not just science. It's not just looking at these same things in different ways and having these sectarian differences. I mean, it blows up to all of society, right? I think there's never been a time. And really, one of the things that I really want to accomplish with this podcast is to address that we don't have to hate each other because we have differences, right? And I think that's a lot of what we're experiencing in the world these days is exactly that. So I think this is probably a really good illustration of how we can have some differences on how to interpret some different things. And I don't think anybody's necessarily either all right or all wrong. It's just some different ways of looking at the same thing, like the blind men with the elephant. And I think that's a great illustration.
Yeah, and the great thing about the blind men and the elephant is that everybody has a point, right? Like there's a localized data set that they have that is they're right about, right? It's just the problem is that when they go from that localized data set and extrapolate out, they reach a conclusion that is ridiculous and that doesn't fit the whole. But also, it's not that anybody sees the elephant, right? So if we want to see the elephant or get closer to seeing the elephant, then we all sort of have to pool our insights. And then, it's the collective that's able to sort of start to approximate some picture of reality. And this is what, science is supposed to be like. But again, you use this fantastic phrase that I've become very fond of is lip service. And then, there's what scientists say, and then there's how they actually behave. And the two don't necessarily fit with each other. So, I mean, I think the IQ research, because it's so controversial, is a good place to see these pieces. So there's what the public often hears, which is this 50-50 number, right? So you'll hear that like intelligence is 50% genetic and intelligence is 50%, a result of nurture or whatever it is, an environment. And, this 50% that's genetic, they'll talk about G or crystallized intelligence. There's some sort of like thing that is, just genetic and that's all there is to it. Okay. So that's sort of the simple model that often floats around. Now, what ends up happening is that, like any of these things, and you see this in politics, you'll see denialism either way, right? So some people will try and pretend that there's no genetic influence. And, some people have spent so much time sort of fighting against the denial that there's any genetic influence that the second that you even start talking about this fixed versus growth mindset stuff, they flip out and they're reacting not to what you're saying, but to what they think you're saying or they feel you're saying, which is that you're some sort of genetic denier. And Katie and I got a bunch of this with the Straight A Conspiracy, and people were either super invested in the idea that they were genetically smart or that they were not genetically smart, right? Because of something they'd been told as a kid, or, they have a thing about genetic denialism or science denialism, and so they see this as a manifestation of that. So now you've got, that's, sort of, we'll call those the people who think the trunk is a snake, right? And that's what they're reacting against. And then you have the people who sort of go to the woo-woo place of trying to pretend that there's no genetic influence. And it's all, like, do you believe in yourself? And it all becomes a little bit vague. And that's a ridiculous position because obviously there are these conditions like, Down syndrome and Tay-Sachs that we can all see.
Now, good point.
The point is that clearly genes matter, but clearly also environment matters and culture matters. And, what is the relative proportion there? Well, okay, so you got this 50-50 number, but then if you go and read the work of someone like Richard Nisbett, who wrote this great book, Intelligence and How to Get It, what you'll find is that 50-50 number is not as simple as it seems. Because if you compare kids who are in sort of great cultural environment, then genetics matter a lot. It's more like 90-10, because essentially their environment is so good, so supportive, so nurturing that the only difference between those kids is genetic. On the other hand, if you go to an environment that is terrible, then it's the other extreme where you're going to find that it's 90% environment, 10% genetics, because their environment is so crappy that these kids aren't in a position to learn at all. For example, if you, like, I have had the experience a few times of teaching in Libya. And, I challenge anybody to go to a school in Libya and think that the issue is genetic. Because those schools are so far from being the kind of environment that any of us would want for our kids, that, there's massive improvements to be made in the environment. So there's that right there already, the 50-50 number. It may be that 50-50 is an average, but even so, it's like any statistics where, if you look at the average, you can reach a totally misleading conclusion. Because
50-50 is just kind of a guess anyway, it sounds like. All right. 50-50 is just an easy number. It's not necessarily, I don't know, maybe there is some research that indicates 50-50 under some conditions, but it sounds like just the easiest number that you can come up with.
It also feels fair, which is, I think, a big part of the appeal of the number.
Fair.
It's like, it feels fair, and humans are driven by intuitions of fairness. So there's all of that. But this is a sort of a really good example of, Mandy Ainsley, who's part of the mixed mental arts community, has this quote from somebody whose name I don't remember. But it's a great quote. He says, "Statistics are like bikinis. What they reveal is important, but what they hide is vital."
There you go. Yes.
And so the point is, when you have people who look at these statistical bikinis, they reach optimization of IQ, and IQ variation is culture.
That makes sense. I think that there's something to that. There may be, like you said, there's probably some genetic component. Whether race matters in that, I have no way of knowing. And if it does, the extent to which it does is, it doesn't seem terribly relevant to much of daily application, right? You deal with individuals, and these group differences in IQ probably don't have much reason to matter. It seems like most of that's a question that is not really that interesting a question to begin with. But I guess the rigor on that correlation does not necessarily mean causation. I think that's a great point to really to really drive home.
Well, and so what Sowell points out is that what you're actually seeing is you're seeing the effects of redneck culture. So in general, hillbillies, rednecks, the Scots-Irish, they don't really value education. And that's because their culture evolved to this environment of herding. And, if you're a herder, right, the Scots-Irish were herders, then there's no point in paying attention or reading a book, right? Because you're just literally watching your sheep all day. If it doesn't, as a friend of mine who's from Alabama says, if you're reading a book, it doesn't make your sheep fuck faster. So your livelihood is not tied to literacy or reading or anything like that. And besides, even if you were reading a book, you would be taking your eyes off of your sheep, making them more vulnerable to theft and wolves and all of that. So these intuitions that book learning is, effeminate, ridiculous, not practical, not grounded in how real people make a living. These are old intuitions that were then brought over to the American South. And then in practice, as Sowell says, there's always been this question of, did black people who were, enslaved and brought over to the United States, did they preserve their authentic African culture, or was it stolen from them? And it was stolen from them. And when cultures, people can't live without a culture, so they ended up blindly copying a lot of the features of redneck culture. And, if you look at a white redneck and a black redneck, you're going to find that there are tremendous similarities, right? There's the same Christianity, strong musical similarities, a lot of the same cuisine, a lot of the same attitudes around violence and honor and defensive-ness, right? I do declare I must defend my honor versus don't disrespect me, right? Yeah. It's the same cultural intuitions, and part of those are around education. So the consequence is that, and this sort of ties back to what we were talking about earlier, if you're not constantly putting yourself in that environment of books and being challenged by ideas, then your brain isn't forced to rise to the occasion. So you're not developing that intelligence. You're just not in that enriched environment. And that has huge consequences over the long term in terms of what you see in IQ scores. The big difference is that 9/10 of black people in America are redneck. They came from the South. Only 1/3 of white people in America are rednecks and come from the South. So what you're actually seeing, it seems like this effect of race, but it's actually an effect of culture. And the big thing is that, of course...
So it sounds like the...
Go ahead.
It seems like that redneck culture has spread, right? I mean, whether New York or Los Angeles, it's still kind of the same culture, right? Of kind of inner city violence, territoriality. I cannot be dissed, kind of a thing. It's the 9/10 number of coming from the South. I guess, is that just kind of a spread of kind of post-slavery that this culture just kind of moves with the black people as they've moved to different locations?
Yeah, just as Scots-Irish redneck culture moved with them when they came across the ocean and settled in the American South. Culture is stubborn, right? It's preserved. It's constantly reinforced through stories and myth. And then we have a tendency, when our beliefs are challenged, to get defensive and to try and hold on to them more tightly. And these are actually evolutionarily adaptive things, right? So your culture is it's the secret sauce that allows you to survive in a particular environment. So if you think about the analogy that I always use, is take somebody from the Amazon rainforest and put them in New York City. How are they going to do?
Oh, they're lost.
Yeah, right? They're done. Now take someone from New York City and put them in the middle of the Amazon rainforest. It's not going to go well.
They're probably even less capable of dealing with that. Yeah.
So the point is that each group of humans has this secret sauce that is shaped to a particular environment. We know what berries to eat. We know what berries are poisonous. We know what the sound of different animals are. We know where to find ATMs. We know how to get money. We know how to get jobs. We know how to be able to navigate this environment. And that's what, our cultural software enables us to do, is it helps us navigate environments. And so historically environments were pretty stable, right? The Amazon did not change much over the last 100,000 years, 10,000 years. 10,000 would be a better number if we're using the Amazon example, because that's a closer approximation of how long humans have been there. So it hasn't changed much over the last 10,000 years. And so preserving your culture was the better bet, right? It's like genes. You don't want too much mutation. You want a low level of mutation that offers enough variability that evolution can happen, but not so much mutation that the thing just heads into chaos. So the problem is that now we're in environments that are defined by change. So all environments are made unstable by this jobocalypse and by constantly changing technology. And so now being defensive of your culture is the worst thing possible for you. And we're all going to have to update our cultural software as new things come along. But, already with that IQ story, you're starting to see, oh, wait, this 50-50 number that made so much sense suddenly doesn't make so much sense. And then especially when you look at, what's called the Flynn effect, which is that IQ scores have gone up over the long term. And, I gave this number, they've gone up 30 points since 1850 in the United States. And they will continue to rise as we are in more and more challenging environments. So IQ is rising all the time. And what, a large part of my job and the job of the mixed mental arts community and anybody else who wants to help with this is that we have to help transition people into this environment of constant change where, there's this Alvin Toffler quote that I'm sure you've heard me use before. In the 21st century, the illiterate will not be those who cannot read and write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. And so we all have to, whether we're 41 or 7, we all have to rejig our cultural intuitions around this idea of learn, unlearn, relearn.
Absolutely, and that's fits right in with the growth mindset that you are continually reinventing yourself and becoming something that fits the environment that you find yourself in now. And I think that's really just a great approach to life, especially in the modern world with this, if not exponential, right, the increasing rate of change that we always see. And it's pretty remarkable that we are there. So you've mentioned mixed mental arts a few times, and I know that that's the name of the community and the podcast and all of those things. What does that term mean?
So it all came out of, Brian and I did this podcast that was originally called Man Thoughts, and then it became the Brian Callen Show. And then I started helping book guests for Brian, and so it became the Brian Callen Show with Hunter Maats, whispered very quietly, because we should all be clear that Brian is the star. And then having interviewed 200 different academics, we basically realized that it was the blind man and the elephant, and that somebody needed to start piecing these ideas together into a coherent worldview. And so, because Brian was into mixed martial arts, I was like, well, why don't we just do mixed mental arts? And, really what it's become clear is it actually turned out to be a great choice, but which we didn't fully realize at the time. But it all really comes down to this very simple thing that Bruce Lee said, which is adapt what is useful, discard what is not, add what is uniquely your own. And that's an approach that moves culture from thinking of culture as identity, like this is who we are. I am, an American, or I am a redneck, or I am an Arab, or I am Cambodian, or whatever. And, being super defensive of my culture and like just holding on to the tools that I have and clutching them tight to my chest, to an approach where instead of thinking of culture as identity, you think of it as toolkit. And that you can pick up and drop tools as needed, you can invent tools as needed, and that you're not particularly hung up on any particular belief or idea or story, because it's not who you are, right? You are not your hammer, right? A hammer is a thing you pick up, used for a time, and then put down. And so that's really, the one of the cornerstones of what it's going to take to navigate this new environment is that it's depersonalizing our beliefs and depersonalizing the failure or success of a particular belief in a particular moment.
That really speaks to the software developer in me. Excuse me. I think a lot of the problems that we have in software communities are that developers tend to get attached to their code, right? I wrote that code, and then when somebody criticizes it and says, here's some ways that could improve, it feels like a personal attack, right? And trying to separate yourself, I am not my code, is one of the really big insights that I've taken away from doing a podcast, interviewing a bunch of software developers. And I think it's the same thing with these things. You've talked a lot too about not only your scientific knowledge, right, facts and figures and all of those things, but feelings being of paramount importance. And I think it's largely the same thing too, right? One of the things that I've kind of picked up from a meditation practice is the idea of observing feelings, right, and not necessarily identifying with them. And the same way that you talked about, pick up the hammer and use it and then put it back down. I kind of see, anger is something that I experience. It's one of the tools that I can use. It's something that, I guess, Darth Vader might tell you that it's what gives you power, but at the same time, it's one of many things that you can leverage. So one of the things that you can experience, and it does something like that. So I think that illustration is really neat, right? And it's it's an impersonalization of these things that we experience, right? Well, not impersonalization. It's still personal, but it's not identifying as them, right? Maybe identifying with them, not necessarily identifying as them. Does that I just made that up. Does that sound reasonable?
I actually think impersonalization is pretty great. I mean, that's the point. Like, I mean,
Okay.
Emotions pop up and then it's like, what was that about? Right? Like, what's going on there? Right? And I think that, it helps to depersonalize these things. And that, it is sort of just watching what comes up and then deciding, is it appropriate or inappropriate? Or, what am I going to do with this, right? I mean, and, anger is a great example. Because obviously, Martin Luther King was angry, right? It's not that he wasn't angry at the injustices of the world. Gandhi was angry. A lot of people are angry about things, and often they're appropriately angry. But the question is, what does that anger then get channeled into? Does it get channeled into constructive social change, or does it get channeled into, like, indiscriminate violence, or something that just creates more chaos and doesn't actually lead to any sort of solution? So an analogy that I stole from a book called The Tao of Pooh, which I will strongly recommend, is there, and this is something that I see a lot, is people often think of emotions as good or bad, right? But Hamlet in Shakespeare has this famous line: "There's nothing good or bad, but thinking makes it so." And the point is that what we're talking about is a shift from thinking of these things as good or bad to a shift to thinking of them as tools. And that is a huge, huge, huge shift. Like, and if we can get humanity making that shift, more and more of us making that shift, and all of those sort of reinforcing those principles with each other and actually living that and not just playing lip service to that, you will literally change the world. Because now what happens is, and this is the Tao of Pooh analogy, is he says, think of your emotions like a piano. And there are all these different notes. And some people are like, this note is bad, and they want to rip the key out of the keyboard. We're just going to feel no shame. There's going to be no fear. There's going to be no anger. We're just going to rip those keys out. And, nobody would say that is an appropriate behavior. The challenge is playing the notes in the right order. And, it's the issue is misplaced anger, right? So it's when you're playing that note of anger at the wrong time, or it's, misdirected anger, or where, I was just at a thing for, inverted commas, troubled teens, and, they defy authority. Defying authority isn't necessarily problematic. It's that they blindly defy authority. They just all the time are hitting that same note of, like, I'm just going to defy authority for the sake of defying authority, rather than being thoughtful or intentional about when to challenge authority, how to challenge authority, and when to respect authority. So, it's really what we all were, taught by our cultures, these particular tunes. And those are tunes that made sense hundreds or thousands of years ago. And now we have to unlearn those tunes and learn new tunes. And, to a the point is that nobody knows what the tune is in this new world because nobody has a culture that has evolved to this world. And so we're going to have to piece
Yeah.
together what this new tune is that humanity is going to play together. And that's part of the fun, is figuring that out.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's something we can work on together, and I think that's wonderful. And with the anger, kind of example, I think of there's been a lot made recently of it's appropriate to be angry and some of those things, and I totally agree with you, and I think you said it really well. And I think that anger is not though a reason to throw the golden rule out the window, right? It's not a reason that to mistreat somebody just because they are the target of your anger. And I think that's a part of the problem that we have in the world today is the idea that there's this othering of people, and it's anger is often used as a justification for, hey, that person is the other, and therefore the same rules don't apply to the way that I treat them.
Yeah, and the point is that that I think this is a thought that I've been wrestling with, and so it's going to come out in a clumsy way. But do you mind workshopping it with me?
Oh, let's do that.
So, I've been trying to engage with people on Twitter and in YouTube comments, and people are like, "Why the fuck are you doing that?" They're like, YouTube comments are where intelligence goes to die or whatever it is that they say. But my feeling is that you know, I think there's a couple of things. One, somebody has to talk to these people. Like, they're human beings and they're behaving the way they are for some reason. And if we don't help them sort through those feelings, then they will just continue to behave that way. So it's one of these sort of collective bargaining dilemmas where nobody's willing to do it, and therefore it doesn't get done. And it's like somebody has to do it.
Yeah.
Somebody has to go in there and clean up that mess. And if you really actually got humanity engaged in helping each other to clean up our emotional messes and whatever traumas and whatever baggage we picked up, I don't think it would take us very long to solve that. So I think that's the first thing, and then the second thing is also that when I mean, the internet there's all sorts of territory on the internet, and if you've just seeded the field, the people who behave in the worst way, then you've given them all control and power. And again, like, I think that's the thing is that what ends up happening is that that's what then then manifests in all of this behavior offline that is so unproductive. So
Yeah.
I mean, I think the point is that I mean, part of what I think we need to do is we need to go out there and we need to remember that yes, everybody is a human being. The golden rule still applies, and that people often don't know why they're upset or why they're angry or why they're
Yeah.
behaving in these things, and they often are coming from some sort of trauma. And if you were in their shoes, if you'd had that screwed up childhood or whatever, you may not you would probably also say horrible things to somebody who came in and tried to challenge you, but in the end you'd be grateful that someone
Yeah.
came in and challenged you.
I think that makes sense. Yeah. So I wanted to ask you about, you mentioned kind of interacting on Twitter and some of these things and challenging people and hopefully, getting to a point where they can thank you for it and that you've helped them kind of see some things a little bit differently than maybe they did. And you specifically, right, have called some people out as fundamentalists and some stuff like that, right? And I have some mixed feelings about that, right? So, sometimes I wonder if, I guess maybe a good place to start would be what you mean by fundamentalism. But I kind of wonder too if calling people fundamentalists might be a form of fundamentalism itself. I'd like to see if you could react to that.
Well, firstly, you're not the first person who's suggested that. The second thing I think is that it's worth noting that firstly, words are symbolic sound symbols designed to represent a concept. And
Yeah.
People often use those terms in different ways, and definitions shift, and there are obviously these terms are not perfect, right? So this sort of gets to the issue of taxonomy, where I mean, when you come from biology, you become very aware of this problem. Where for example, Darwin spent 8 years studying barnacles, and what he really learned in his 7 to 8 years of studying barnacles was that even though we come up with these groupings called species, that actually when you look at the edge cases, you realize that those lines are kind of arbitrary, and that a particular barnacle, an individual barnacle, could fall one way or the other based on who the taxonomer is. So I think that's, it's the same
Yeah.
thing with grouping humans, right? And even with these large cultural groupings, when we talk about, for example, honor cultures or rednecks or anything like that, right? Like individual cases won't
Yeah.
necessarily.
Broad brushes.
That's right. We're painting with broad brushstrokes here. So what this really comes out of is, my parents live in the Middle East, and so obviously, if you're, or maybe not obviously to Americans, or people who don't have much exposure to the Arab world, when you're in the Arab world, there's a lot of talk about fundamentalism and a lot of talk about
Mm.
Islamic terrorism and what that is and how it works, right? They've spent a lot of time staring
Yeah.
at and trying to understand that problem. And I just sort of started to notice this big contrast between how Islamic fundamentalism is discussed in the United States and how it is discussed in the Arab world. And there's in the West, it's often regarded as an issue of ideology, right? And you'll have certain people like Sam Harris or Richard Dawkins who will paint this picture that the issue is just Islam. Islam is the problem. Religion is the problem. And, that needs to be changed. And that narrative, again, the blind man and the elephant, makes a lot of sense to people in the Arab world. But I would hear those stories, and they didn't very well fit what I knew having spent time around Arabs. The picture that he was being painted was not what I had experienced of the Arab world. I'd found the Arab people to be very hospitable, to be very generous, some of the most hospitable and generous, and that, their religion actually gave them a lot of, the ones who really engaged with the religion were very reflective, very thoughtful, often very cultured, and that regardless that, there wasn't, it just didn't seem to fit. And then on the other hand, we have a family friend in the Arab world who he always says it takes 5 seconds to become a fundamentalist and a lifetime to become a Muslim. And this really struck
Yeah.
true for me on my own experiences with science. Because as a teenager, I had learned all the dogma of science. I'd memorized all the things, the plants, the species, the this, the that. And, I would go around and I would recite those facts. And I would, be like, I understand this because I can quote lots of things. And you'll see the same thing in Islam. Young kids will go around and they'll memorize the Quran. It's a big deal to be the kid who can memorize the Quran and remember it completely. It's like their spelling
Yeah.
bee. So, I've had the experience over the last 20 years of coming to really understand that even though I had memorized all these things and learned them, that I actually didn't understand science at all. Right? I hadn't gone on the personal journey to understand myself well enough, to understand how my mind works, to understand how my mind creates stories and how my emotions shape my reality and how naive realism causes all beliefs to make sense to people, to understand why on a deeply personal level, science isn't just something you pay lip service, it's something you have to live. And so part of what was helpful was Atul Gawande, who's one of the greatest science writers alive, in my opinion, gave this speech at Caltech. And he said that the difference between the scientific mind and that the scientific mind is an experimental one, not a litigious one. So, that means that you're always testing your beliefs, you're always checking things out, you're never quite sure and you're playing around with ideas, and it's about a spirit of play, as opposed to a litigious one where you're like, I know the answer, it's this, there are this many species, these are the rules, and anybody who disagrees is wrong. And
Yeah.
and having read the work of John Haidt, he has this great book, Righteous Minds: Why Good People Disagree Over Religion and Politics. And what I came to realize is that the issue, I don't think, is ideology. The issue is psychology. And what you realize when you see that is that we've been grouping humans in the wrong way when we start to think about fundamentalism. And that instead of grouping people based on their ideology, you're a Muslim, you're an atheist, you're a social justice warrior, you're a this, you're a that, we should be grouping people based on their psychology. This person on this particular issue has a righteous mind. They think they know it all, right? They're one of the blind men who is like, I really know that this is a rope. I know that this is a snake, and anyone who disagrees with me is an idiot. As opposed to
a self-righteous mind.
Exactly. And as opposed to people who have an experimental mind and are trying to explore. And so I decided to try and, sort of experiment with, okay, what if instead of grouping, what if I try and basically popularize this taxonomy where we try and group people in one group, which is fundamentalists, and then we put the other humans in this other group, which I'll call a basket of reasonables. And, if you could get people to see the world through that taxonomy, that grouping, then you can get that basket of reasonables together and they can start having productive conversations, clarify the picture of the elephant enough that then it becomes clear that the guy who thinks it's a rope, it's a spear, it's a snake, are, they have a point, but they've extrapolated out so far that they've missed the picture. And so I decided, okay, so let's do this. So I said, okay, we're going to pick a fundamentalist from each group, some sort of popular figure in each group. And, we're going to highlight their sort of the basic sameness of their psychology. And then we're going to tease them. And the reason for teasing is because a lot of what that self-righteousness, you can't laugh at yourself. You take yourself so seriously that you can't possibly laugh at yourself. And so, already the world has started to experiment with this with ISIS, with some of the stuff with, the alt-right, where they tease these people, right? There's a great video of this guy who showed up to some neo-Nazi rally or some KKK rally, and he just showed up with a tuba and marched behind them and just played this obnoxious tuba very loudly, including the Imperial Death March from Star Wars. And it just, rather than, it changes the emotional context around that, where suddenly this march, rather than being scary, seems ridiculous. And so I was like, okay, let's try and hang a nickname on each of these different figures. And so I picked Lena Dunham from the Social Justice Warriors. I picked Richard B. Spencer from the alt-right. I picked Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins from the New Atheists, or from atheism. I picked, can't remember who else there was. I think those were there may have been some other ones. But anyway, so I experimented with all of these and I came up with nicknames and sort of, some sort of teasing to sort of like check their power, just to see as an experiment what would actually happen. And I really only, I was sad because I thought the funniest thing that I did was with Lena Dunham, but that didn't get any particular reaction. But Richard B. Spencer I called Emo Kylo Ren, because, I mean, that's like, he rebelled against the rebellion. Like, he has literally the coolest parents in the galaxy. And then he's like, I'm going to the dark side because I'm so emo. But obviously, if you start thinking of Richard B. Spencer as emo, and begin a conversation with him, like, let's talk about your feelings, dude, what's going on here, and you actually like are persistent enough in that questioning where he can no longer avoid the question, then you've robbed him of all power or mystique, because now you're just going to see, oh, dude, what is this actually about? This is about whatever insecurities you never knew how to deal with. Um,
It sounds like an interesting approach, and it sounds. I mean, there's some appeal to it. I guess I wonder if it and I guess it appeals because I think of Harry Potter immediately, right? There's this thing called the Bogart in Harry Potter, right? That embodies it. It takes the form of your greatest fear, and the counterspell ridiculous turns it into something laughable, and that's appealing. To turn that story from Harry Potter into something in the real world. And I think it sounds appealing. I wonder about the practicality of that. I think I'm in some circles with some listeners of the Tom Woods show, right? And I am a supporting listener of the Tom Woods show, and he's another one that you've kind of taken to task as being a fundamentalist, and I know that a lot of people kind of are taken aback by that, and rather than kind of lightening the thing and seeing this as something amusing, it becomes this entrenchment into camps, right? And so I don't know that I guess maybe I'll just ask you, right? Have you seen positive results from that approach to trying to take this on?
Yeah, so I actually did get engagement from Tom as well. So I think the Tom is a good. If you like Tom, then that's a good example of it, right? So so Tom is I think a really good example of the blind man and the elephant. So Tom, so it's like communism. Communism starts from this very simple moral intuition that things should be equal, right? So we are like, okay, things should be equal, and then from that perfectly respectable, positive moral intuition. And from that sort of philosophical principle, they then extrapolate out and imagine a whole worldview. Now, okay, that's great, right? But that's no different from I start from the hairs at the end of the elephant's tail and I extrapolate out. And the picture that communism develops of a society is actually ridiculous and leads to a lot of human suffering and a lot of disaster. In the same way, Tom Woods, begins from the simple moral intuition of liberty. And extrapolates out from there, and where a lot of sort of the more extreme versions of libertarianism reach is this idea that the problem is government, and they think that the government's monopoly on legitimate violence is a bug, but it's actually a feature. And if you look at what happens around the world when governments are removed and when there is no government, you get a power vacuum. See Iraq, see the removal of Saddam Hussein, and into that power vacuum then rushes some organization like ISIS. And that's just a basic feature of human biology is that people form tribes, they form gangs, and that, if you don't have some sort of legitimate institution that has a monopoly on legitimate violence, then you will have a competition through violence. And so that's challenging for a lot of people who sort of get very excited about liberty and the free market because they think that all monopolies are bad. But as we know, nothing is good or bad, but thinking makes it so. And so the problem is that what ends up happening when you try and engage a guy, like, for example, so Tom was actually a big part of why I started thinking about this, because we had Tom on Mixed Mental Arts. Tom, because we were committed at that stage, let everybody have their say. People were like, you need to get Tom Woods on. So we had Tom. Brian and I, having grown up in the developing world, thought that what Tom was saying was nuts. And then Tom, went and did his spiel. And then after that, I, got all these messages from young people who were saying, especially after I called Tom out, like, I was so upset that you did that. Like, how could you do that? It was because of your podcast with Tom Woods that I was drawn to anarcho-capitalism, because Tom Woods housed you in that debate. Like, he destroyed you in that debate. And Brian and I didn't even realize we were in a debate. It wasn't a debate. But if you have kids who don't necessarily know very much, or who don't understand very much, or who don't have the context to know what you're trying to achieve with this, they pick up on that social drama, and then they think, oh, Tom won, and they want to be with the winner, and they want to be with what's exciting and what's challenging. And this is, by the way, the same reason why a young Arab guy would be drawn towards ISIS, right? Because they are the ISIS guys are, or any of these sort of extremist fundamentalist thinkers. They're much more litigious. Tom is much more litigious than I am. And they will worry away at your argument and atomize it away until it seems like you've lost. And then what ends up happening is that some small percentage of people will hear that, and they will think that, oh, the winning side is this guy, I should be with this guy. And then in a time of uncertainty, like we live in now, people are drawn towards certainty. And that's the point, is that what unifies all these fundamentalists, whether it's Tom Woods or, Lena Dunham or Sam Harris or Richard B. Spencer or Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi or any of these guys, is that they sell certainty and they sell simplicity in a time of uncertainty and a time of complexity. And
I think Tom Woods is probably, and Sam Harris as well, are probably more nuanced than the picture you paint there, right? I mean, in fairness to them, I think that yes, anarcho-capitalism is a view of that, that government is a net negative and that we'd be better off without it. I don't think it's necessarily saying that blame government for everything. There probably are adherents that do say that, but at the same time, I think that Tom Woods has some positions that are not necessarily just all about the simple solution. Although he does skew toward one end of that ideological idea. But I think that it's valuable to take this view of making sure that there is some nuance in the thing. And it was striking to me too that when you had Tom on the show and I listened to that, kind of at the end you were commenting on that he was committed to intellectual consistency, and you said a lot of really nice things about him. And I mean, it would have never even occurred to me that, hey, this is a debate. You guys were having a conversation and sharing his view exactly like you said. So that is interesting that debate is a word. I want to make sure that I'm not debating people with this show, because it is exactly what you said, right? It's at the end of a debate, it's, well, who won, right? And that's it often gets in the way of a meaningful exchange of ideas, right? The idea sex that you like to talk about.
Yeah, and that's the point. What we want is we want idea sex. And the problem is that, there's what a guy like Sam Harris or Tom Woods believes. And that's not necessarily the same thing as what his listeners hear. And, as a teacher, you come to understand that, right? Like, you work, especially if you're a tutor and you work one-on-one with students, you're often putting out a certain message, and then you come to find out 6 months later, wait a minute, when I said that, that's what you heard? That's how you interpreted that? You thought I was saying this, and you're like, that is not what I was saying at all. So, the point is not necessarily that people are even intending these things. But again, what you have to understand is that Islam is an intellectual ecosystem. And there's a series of speakers and, imams and thinkers and judges, and they range from, the extremely moderate, it's no different than, say, the West, to more and more and more radical. But what ends up happening is that there's a chain of radicalization that happens for some group of young lost Muslims, and each of these people ends up being a link in that chain that takes people further and further up and further away from being productive members of society. And then, the analogy that my dad uses is that, like, a lot of people get on the elevator. Some of them will get off at the third floor, but some of them will go all the way to the posthouse. And it's the same thing with, say, atheism, right? Or with, libertarianism. a lot of people get on those elevators, and some people will get off at the third floor, but some people will ride it all the way up to the penthouse. Now, obviously, the big difference is violence, right? So in the, both Sam Harris and Tom Woods don't condone violence, right? And they view that as their big distinguisher. But I would say less so the anarcho-capitalists, but certainly a lot of the new atheists end up at the penthouse is this anti-theism thing, which is this sort of extreme thing where we're not just saying we don't believe in God, it's that we're actually against the idea of God, and we believe the idea of God is bad and is the cause of the world's problem. And the sorts of self-righteousness and the sort of strident behavior that is manifested there, what that ends up doing is that it ends up creating a divisive environment where you can't have productive disagreements. And where what ends up happening is that rather than having this basket of reasonables, there is this fractioning and this partisanship that is driven. And even though they're a tiny minority, just as fundamentalist Muslims are a tiny minority, they create a spirit of divisiveness that prevents the community from having productive conversations, and that drags attention away from sort of this core problem of how do we deal with things like the jobocalypse, how do we deal with complexity.
That contributes to the what you were talking about with the identifying with this feeling is me, and therefore if you oppose this thing that I oppose, then you're the enemy, and it's the heated differences, like you said. I think that makes a lot of sense. And within the community of Tom Woods listeners that I joined, I was really shocked that there was kind of a question about abortion came up, and the vitriol that people had towards each other within this community, right? It felt like something that I would see from kind of a social justice kind of a community, right? Of that, name calling and all of the things that I see in these videos, of the social justice kind of stuff, which really lends credence to the idea that yeah, I mean, we're all susceptible to this tribalism, this fundamentalism. I think it makes a lot of sense.
Bingo. So now what you're doing is you're looking at social dynamics, and you're looking at behavior rather than looking at what the particular ideology is or how people are justifying that.
Ideology. Yeah.
That's right. And so that was the real goal of this. And part of it is that, if I had written some sort of abstract piece about this, that would be one thing. But I was with all of this science, you can read all this science until the cows come home, but at a certain point you have to try it and you have to apply it in the real world. And so I was like, okay, let's hijack some people's celebrity. Like, these people are famous. Let's give people some famous figures to think about. And to be entirely clear, I didn't know what I was doing. I mean, I had some ideas, but this was very much like I had some loosely thought out ideas, and then I would go and try and test them out. And then I've had, a lot of conversations, a lot of pushback, a lot of different thoughts. And, my own thinking has evolved massively. I saw my father recently, and he was like, it's very clear to me that you have learned more in the last 8 months than you have learned in the first 36 years. And that is 100% true.
Wow.
Because I'm suddenly in this...
that's remarkable.
Yeah. And that's because I'm suddenly in this environment where I'm being challenged in all these different ways and having to think much harder than I would normally have to think. And so, I mean, I would say that the point is that I think that this gives us a real reality on fundamentalism, and what it takes to challenge it, where you can have a guy like Tom or Sam Harris or Lena Dunham or Richard P. Spencer, although I think emo Kylo Ren is particularly ridiculous. But, who for whatever reason has reached whatever conclusions they are. And I mean, I think that's the interesting thing, is this idea of intellectual consistency is that, I mean, the number one profession among sort of Islamic fundamentalists is engineers, because they like things very tidy. And so they create these very tidy worldviews, And the problem is that those tidy worldviews often, it generates a certain amount of self-righteousness, but those tidy worldviews are not necessarily a good fit for reality. And that's the problem is that, there's no doubt in my mind that Sam Harris or Tom Woods or, I don't know about the other two, but that Sam Harris and Tom Woods certainly have very tidy worldviews. But the problem is that those tidy worldviews aren't necessarily a good fit for reality. And in fact, they're not, right? So it's very tidy to believe that the trunk is a snake or that the tail is a rope, but it doesn't necessarily fit with the much bigger picture of the elephant. And the point is that if we can start having conversations with this, and so part of what sort of evolved out of this whole idea was this strategy of create the controversy to teach the controversy. So if we want to go back to our IQ conversation, so if you give an intelligence test to a chimp, an orangutan, and a human toddler, then on spatial reasoning, we're dumber than chimps. On causal reasoning, figuring out why things happen, human toddlers are dumber than chimps. And on quantitative reasoning, human toddlers are dumber than chimps. There's only one area in which humans are off the charts intelligence, and that's social intelligence. And so if you look at sort of how nonviolent conflict has been done throughout history, that's actually a lot of what it rests on. It rests on political theater. And so if you have an event like Rosa Parks sitting down in the white section of the bus, it's amazing political theater because Rosa Parks is, this elderly, very law-abiding, well-behaved black woman, just like the last person you would think would ever break a law. And then she sits down in the white section of the bus. And it's the most inoffensive possible crime, right? And it's very clear that they knew what they were doing. They staged it. They made sure. And then it creates this drama that people are forced to wrestle with and forced to try and make sense of. And that as they do, they come to develop that causal intelligence and come to understand things more deeply. So the idea that sort of evolved was, you create the controversy. So I, 9 months ago, created this controversy by calling out these, 4 or 5 figures who many people respect, many people like as fundamentalists. And that's created social drama. And then out of that social drama, now you have captured people's attention. And now you can have conversations like this and you can teach the controversy and then you can start to reflect on it, right? And so now you're like, I spent time in the Tom Woods group. I see the kind of behavior that is empowered there. It seems a lot like what social justice warriors would do. Maybe there's a point here. And so that's really the idea.
Yeah, I mean, I want to be clear, I will still disagree that Tom Woods is a fundamentalist, and I do, I do respect many of the people in the Tom Woods community, and I don't think, I think this example of this kind of behavior, though I would point out that it exists and that it lends credence to that we should draw these lines around this thing, right? The othering of people and the hastiness to drop the rules of decorum because you see somebody as something else, I think is a big piece of, I would say, what you're calling fundamentalism. I'm not sure if you would completely agree with that. But I think that there are elements of that everywhere. And I guess really, I mean, fundamentalism is a spectrum too, right? In the same way that I wouldn't say that Tom Woods is a fundamentalist. I'd say that all of us have some degree of fundamentalism in the way that we look at things.
Yeah, and we all have certain, bête noire or idée fixe, right? So there's certain areas in which and what this really comes down to is that litigious mind rather than that experimental mind, is it comes down to a certain rigidity, right? We've locked onto a certain idea and we're not letting go of that idea, right? We found our little piece of the elephant, and anybody who tries to tell us that what we're holding is not a snake is a denialist and is a liar and is whatever else. And it's the ability to be flexible and to adapt to whatever situation and say, okay, I know my piece, and that's part of the. But let me see what else there is. Let's see what other sides to the story there are, and let me see if I can round out my worldview. And maybe I'll find out that this thing that is wriggling that I thought was a snake is actually the trunk of an elephant. So
Beautiful.
that's
Yeah.
so that's very much the point here. But the I think part of what the challenge is that we all know that something is off, right? We all know that these conversations are not being had productively. We can see events like Charlottesville, we can see ISIS, we can see all these problems, and the question is, how do we now move forward? And part of it is that we have to just, I think we have to intentionally find ways to start to shake up these echo chambers. So how do you shake up those echo chambers and get people exposed to some of the new ideas, some of the other ideas, so that they can round out their worldview? Because echo chambers are a problem, not just because they create political divisiveness. They're a problem because if you're staying in an echo chamber, you are setting yourself up to fail in the new economy, because you are going to have all sorts of mental rigidity. And so this is the other part of mixed mental arts, is that Bruce Lee's goal was always to to be like water. And that is very much what is required to navigate an environment that is dominated by change and uncertainty, is the ability to flow and go wherever it goes, so that you're not just going to rigidly hold on to whatever idea that you have.
Yeah, I really like the formulation of strong beliefs weakly held. I don't remember where I heard that, but I think that's a really neat way to look at it.
Yeah, and I think it's, the point is that everything is always being tested, right? And that is really what science is supposed to be about, right? Is that you're constantly testing your assumptions. Science isn't something that happens, because you have a white lab coat or because you're at a university. It's a way of life, and you can always be testing your own assumptions.
Yeah, and there's very much science fundamentalism too, right? You must listen to the white coats, and whatever they pronounce is the gospel, and you are a denier if you say anything otherwise, even if you are another white coat, right?
And this gets to a much larger point, which is that humans are cultish, and that we form cults, and that's John Haidt says humans are groupish. I think rather than sort of academics sort of favor these soft, non-offensive terms like group-ish, I would just rather say everything is a cult, and it doesn't really matter. I mean, if you look around the world, you now have, thanks to the internet and globalization, you can see lots and lots of cultures. You can wander around the internet without leaving your chair, and you can see lots and lots of cults. They all form their own orthodoxies. They all sort of have their figures who they worship and revere and unquestioningly follow. And then how accountable do they hold those figures? How receptive are they to new ideas? How do they deal when challenged? And so I think that, it's much more useful rather than the real problem is when people don't think they're in a cult, because then you can't manage the cultishness, and as opposed to accepting humans are cultish, and then you're now in a problem of we have to, and if you're working in a company or something, this, right? You're like, there are tribes, orthodoxies develop. You talked about it in terms of software engineers, right? I'm sure that you could talk about the cultishness of software engineers.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, especially this past week with the whole Google memo debacle, right? I mean, that's you see people lining up on sides, and the torches and pitchforks come out, and it's if you're not on my side of this abyss, then you are the enemy, and nobody is immune to it, and it's painful that's the way that we have to exist, and it's just ugly. As you were talking there about cults, it kind of struck me, and I'm no etymologist, or is it entomologist? I can never remember which one's words and which one's bugs. But that cult and culture, right? I mean, it sounds like they have a common root, and that there's some some connection to those words. And you being the kind of the walking Google now that you are, might have some knowledge on that. But is there an association of those things?
Yep. You are 100% correct. And so entomology is bugs, and then etymology is the origin of words. But yeah, it's the same root, and that's the point. Is that the challenge is that I mean, firstly, there's no reason. I mean, this is the whole point of sort of doing this whole mixed mental arts and doing this fundamentalism thing. Is that by doing this sort of political theater, you attract people's attention, and then because of mixed mental arts, right? The whole point is add what is useful, discard what is not, add what is uniquely your own. The point is you're going to take from this conversation whatever you find useful. Some parts, you're not going to accept, and that's great, because that's what we want. Is we want the remixing of ideas and to help people sort of evolve the toolkits that are more useful to them. But there's absolutely, we can't go on living this way where everybody is fighting at each other's throats. And what it takes individuals willing to work on themselves to literally be the change they want to see in the world, and to figure out how to democratize and share these ways of thinking with people, help people work through their particular fundamentalism, to help them let go of the bit of the elephant that they know and say, yes, that's a part of the picture, but it's not the whole picture. So let's see if we can all round out the picture together. And that's the work that it's going to take. And, the more of us that are doing it, the more of us that, this basket of reasonables that are collaborating. And great thing that I stole from, there's these two artists in the UK named Fantic and Young, and they reached out and they really liked what we were doing. And so one of the things they shared with me was, they're a husband and wife team who makes art together. And so, you take the challenges of a marriage, and then you add in, and we're also going to work together. And they have this great phrase that, is just, I think, such a perfect articulation of what we need. And they said, we realized long ago that we could either gang up on each other or gang up on the problem. And that is
nice.
what humanity needs. Is, it's like, okay, fine, we're ganging up on each other. But the reality is there's a problem. And the problem is that we're all in an environment where nobody knows how the world works anymore. Nobody knows how we're going to provide people with jobs, with dignity, with prosperity in an age when, robots and software are doing so much of the work. And so rather than being at each other's throats, let's gang up on that problem and let's have these conversations. Let's figure out how to do it. Let's figure out whatever incremental practical change we can make now. And we've talked about some of that in terms of changing how we think about, learning and knowledge and our ideas. And there's a lot more. And the more we share our insights, the more we can fix this problem quite quickly.
I like that, right? We have reasons to fear. Let's just get clear on what it is we have to fear, and that it's not each other, right? That we can be assets to each other. We can be allies. That's great. I think that's probably a pretty good place to leave this. I think this has been a really good conversation, Hunter, and I really appreciate you having this conversation with me. And you're helping me to grow, and I appreciate that. I would say that the thing that I'm taking away more than anything is the elephant, right? When I take my piece of the elephant and I look at that thing and I say that gives me a knowledge of all of this stuff, that is nothing more than hubris. And hubris, I guess, is another name for fundamentalism, and that is a pretty good thing to oppose. And even though we may differ on who qualifies as a fundamentalist, I think we do share that is the nature of the problem.
Yeah, and just to define the size of that elephant and sort of give us some scope and dimension on it. There are 60 million scientific papers and 130 million books. So the point is that the idea that any individual human is actually capable of knowing it all is a truly ridiculous notion. And we should regard anyone who is behaving or acting that way in any situation at any time as truly ridiculous. There's a giant-assed elephant, and, the old line, like, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. And that is, and it's going to take a lot of us ganging up on that woolly mammoth to bring it down and to figure it out.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Hunter.
All right. Thanks so much, David. Have a good day.